I wanted to start tonight. We left off last week talking about mommy Selena, and how she was so heartbroken and grief-stricken after her husband had died, and we couldn't really figure out why, since he was kind of this useless drunk in a way in these first few pages. And I was just so impressed at how the next chapters were laid out, especially chapter 7, where we get her story. It kind of reminded me of the author talk that we had with the author of When I Was Puerto Rican. What was her name, Ron? I always forget.
Esmeralda
Santiago. She said something in that chat. I remember she was talking about kind of why she wrote that book, that memoir, and she was saying it was because she really wanted to have something for her children to read and understand their ancestry, understand where they came from, understand who she was before she had them. And I think that chapter 7 really takes us there, into that idea of Selena before she had children and where she came from and why she was the way that she was. And I thought it was really beautiful how that chapter told Selena's story so we could have our own opinion of her, kind of without Sonia's judgment, without the author's judgment, without the author's perception of her. We kind of got to take in her story in PR, where I couldn't quite put my finger on it. Maybe y'all can help me out. Was the mom, was she just kind of like, she wasn't addicted to drugs or alcohol? Was she just kind of out of it? They didn't really dive into what was going on with Selena's mother and why she was in the house, but seemed very absent. Did anyone else catch that?
I'm gonna flip back and maybe I can find something more concrete, but I just interpreted it as like she was grieving so heavily that she literally disassociated from her responsibilities. And I think that because I think I remember Sonia writing that she wore a lot of black. I think she kept the house like very dark. She never really came out, only to feed them. They like did their homework on their own. They, got themselves ready. So I just assumed that like in a way to just express her grief, she just shut out and stopped taking care of her responsibilities. And as a result, her children had to kind of like step up and really fend for themselves.
That was Selena's after Poppy died. But when in chapter 7, when Sonia, the author, is telling Selena's story of her mother seems to be in that exact same space, but we don't really get a reason why.
Are you talking about Selena's mother? That will be Sonia.
Yeah. Right.
Okay, yeah. I got the feeling that she became very ill, became very sick, and then she passed away.
That's what I thought too.
Yeah, that's
on page,
got from
was an invalid.
Yeah, on page 65, it says that her own mother was sick and invalid as far back as she could remember.
Oh, so she was okay.
In Puerto Rico, healthcare, I'm sorry, it still is today, was not very good.
Yeah.
And there were all kind of diseases, tuberculosis, and things that perhaps mainly in the United States were still going on very rapidly there.
Yeah.
So there were a lot of deaths, and I think her mother fell into that category. She became very sick and she passed away.
Yeah.
And that's when Selena, now Sonia's mom, is the youngest one.
Yeah.
And that's when she has to go and live with her sister, or because she doesn't want to be placed in an orphanage.
Right.
Okay. And that's when she talks on, life was hard there. It was a hard life, right? And then obviously her break comes when she joins the military, right? And that's when things, okay, now we're moving forward. I didn't mean to delay the question though.
Oh, no. I just thought it was absolutely, I thank you for that response. It's just so interesting to me how she was so sick and invalid, but was able to have a child.
It happens.
She was also, I got the impression that Selena was significantly younger than her older siblings, her and Pedro.
Mhm. I think she was 16 years younger than her older sister. That's a
Yeah.
big age gap.
That's a big age gap. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, she was the youngest one.
Yeah.
So I guess it had to be hard because that means that she would always be treated like not as an adult, but as a child, okay? And she even talks in the chapter about like the beatings that she would get from the older brother,
Yeah.
okay? So
Mayo, right?
Maya, yep.
Yeah.
I'm glad you brought that up so early because last week Ron said something about how a lot of the books that we read, the father or the father figure seems to be, like either abusive or emotionally neglectful or literally just not around at all or an alcoholic. And that idea doesn't fail in these pages either. Not only was Selena's dad he just left them, but the father figure, the brother, Mayo, was terribly, it sounds like he was terribly abusive. So there's something to that, how we kind of praise the mothers in these books that we're reading. And I don't know if we
Well, I don't know if you're familiar with the history of Puerto Rico, a little bit of it, the Operation Bootstrap,
Yeah.
where the United States came over and just cut off the main agricultural economic situation that basically the men were doing at the time. So they came and they built factories, and then about a year or two later, they found somebody else, I don't know where, but not in Puerto Rico. They shut down the factories. Now they left these men without work, without any skills to speak of. So, not to make excuses for them, and then when the women go off to the United States or New York or join, like the services, they become empowered. And the men, unfortunately, they just make kids, and they try to keep a roof over the women's heads, and but that Operation Bootstrap was not really demasculated a lot of men.
And we did speak about that a little bit in the previous, when I was Puerto Rican, had the same theme. You're right, Anna.
And the truth is too that the culture, that was just the culture, that was the way of thinking of a lot of the men there. It wasn't about it was very macho, right, during that time. And they were the boss, and if they couldn't be, that's why Sonia admired her dad so much, because he was okay with his wife being ambitious and being the breadwinner. He was okay with it, with her wanting to go back to school. And because she saw with her own eyes that the other men in her family were not like that. They wouldn't allow that. They were too insecure.
Yep, she even writes on page 69, when she's talking about going to, or her brother got married and he went off to the army, and she never saw her grandmother again after her mom died. And she writes, that's just the way it was. There was never any choice. So there was not much room for feelings. And you can kind of see how she carried that into her own family life, at least up until a point. Definitely up until, or right after her husband died. She never really knew how to process her feelings at all. So you can tell that, right? When her husband dies, you can tell that she's never had any real experience processing feelings or processing grief or any type of emotion. Even happy.
She was even verbally abusive to him, right? For his drinking, the fights. Sonia talked a lot about how they fought all the time, especially about his drinking. So it wasn't, you could tell that it wasn't a good, it didn't have good communication skills.
Sad.
Yeah.
You know, she says that her mom was so lonely all the time and so quiet that in school practically no one knew she was there. That's deep.
Yeah.
You know, that's really deep. And then
It's
she gets to, oh, go ahead, Susan.
No, I was just gonna say that it's almost like just not wanting to just blend in so that you never noticed.
Yeah.
I noticed that with a lot of English language learners in my classrooms. If you don't go and approach them, they will never say a word to you. They will never raise their hands. They will never participate, a lot of them. And I wonder if she felt like that, you know, just wanting to just.
What grade do you teach? Is this like grade school you teach?
I teach middle school.
Hmm.
I'm teaching 8th grade
Wow.
this year.
Wow, I'm gonna light a candle for you, girl.
3, could you light 3, please?
Can you light one for me too, please, Anna?
I like candles
Light one
all
for
the
me
time.
too, please. I
Middle
teach
school?
kindergarten.
I told that. That's you could get around them.
You know, I kind of understood like later on in the chapters though why their house was, she called it, Sonia kind of describes it as like the place to be when she was in high school. And I think that's probably because her mother, you know, didn't have that at all. Her mother's childhood was a complete opposite, you know, so she kind of made her house, you know, with Sonia and Junior, like the happening spot. She was probably, you know, very proud of that.
Yeah, but their father had passed away. So if he had been around, I imagine that still wouldn't have been the case because, you know, there was something to be ashamed of, right?
And I think she mentions like when he was alive, no one ever came to their house.
No one did. I think it was good to get a background on her mother. I think that was an interesting chapter, and it's a lot of history involved with it. The only thing that I found missing, and her mother can't speak for her father, but it was not quite clear to me when the drinking began. It seemed after Sonia was born, and what sort of drove it. It seems like they made an assumption that, when he was no longer working at that job with the mannequins and he went off to another job, that sort of started some of that, but it's not quite clear from that chapter what really changed that resulted in that. Like, again, her mother can't speak for their father, but it's still quite unclear what, when that behavior really started kicking in, and when it changed. I mean, for Sonia, it probably, I'm just gonna let that go by, but for Sonia, it's crazy. But for Sonia, it probably didn't make any difference. That's probably her clearest memory of the dynamics of their relationship. So her remembering any different probably doesn't exist in her mind. But I think that was the only thing that was lacking in that chapter for me. I really, it was great to get an understanding of her mom's background, where she came from, how she struggled, how she met her father, and even to a certain extent, the education level of her father, and how I was surprised to learn that she initially had a great relationship with her mother-in-law, and that changed over time. But I still don't have an understanding of what was that, where was, like the arch of the story, what was the change in her father, what really drove that?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Anybody else want to add to that?
I think what was missing for me too is that, I mean, I have two minds about it, but I think what was missing for me too is just like why Sonia's like paternal grandmother, or at least what we've read so far, never did anything about it in terms of having a conversation with him or trying to have some type of mediation. And I know that that's a conversation, especially now recently with a lot of the celebrities who have been passing away from like drug overdose. A lot of people who are in spaces with those people tend to not do anything about it because it kind of becomes normalized. But I think it was just quite upsetting for the grandmother. I pictured her as someone, she was basically the crux of the family, and also someone who seemed to kind of put herself in spaces that she felt entitled to put herself in spaces as the grandmother. Why she didn't just step up and do something, because he was literally drinking himself to death in front of everyone, and everyone avoided him. Physically and emotionally avoided him, but there was no like confrontation. And when there was a conversation about it, it was put onto the wife, which was not fair. And I feel like that's very realistic, and that's very like typical, I would say, specifically like I would say of like Afro-Caribbean cultures. Like that's definitely something that I've witnessed in my own family dynamic, how like when the man is not doing things or stepping up the way he's supposed to be doing, is because the wife is doing something wrong or lacking something. And I just didn't, I wish we got more of that, but maybe it was left out because she never felt the need to really get involved.
Yes. Yes, that's definitely, Simone and Myra, thank you, because those points are just so valid and so important to this particular story. We don't get, I wrote the same thing down, we don't get anything really about Poppy's story. I think there was a line in there, it was really quick, about how his drinking started when his stepfather came in the picture, but that was it. And there was a line in there that I thought was important, that the author wrote about how back then it was hard to tell the difference between casual drinking and heavy drinking. And I think like that's really important too, right? Because it's easy to kind of read this with a 2020 lens or 2021 lens.
Heavy drinking was the norm back then. Nobody drank wine. Nobody drank wine coolers and all that stuff. You drank bourbon and you drank scotch.
And
rum. You drank rum. There was no in between. There is a scene earlier on in the book which seems to come out of nowhere, where they see the father is sort of getting drunk, but it almost feels like they're witnessing him getting sick. You know, because I think he goes into they're at a family event and he goes into a back room or something and he just goes back there and drinks. But there's no explanation as to what set it off or anything like that.
You know, I mean, during the time period also, Sonia and I are basically contemporaries. And that time period, as long as your husband was providing and you had a roof, nobody cared about the drinking part. The drinking part was considered, that was okay. You just have to deal with that. So the mother-in-law would blame the wife if she didn't turn the other way. Why do you think this is a problem? You have a roof, he's there with the kids. He may not be contributing a lot financially, but he was taking care of those. He cooked for those kids. He was present, and that counted for a lot as far as the mother. And the grandmother probably just figured, well, you know, that's enough. He's doing what he can.
True, being present is a big thing.
A big debate we always have in this book club.
Shut up, Ron.
Is being present enough? Is it enough? Is it, if you're sauced up all the time and happy?
Look, I never had a father, but I know plenty of my cousins, they just worship them, man. And we saw in Esmeralda Santiago, and there was question, why is she worshiping her father so much? And, you know, you gotta just, you know, because he was there. You know, I didn't worship anybody. I don't miss him. If he died tomorrow, I wouldn't care. But it's like, you know, he was there at times, off and on. So you got to give him props.
Yeah. And you also got to remember, again, thinking how things were back then, men were just the center of existence. You know, everything revolved around, even if you didn't have a father, I would bet that there was another man in your greater household. It could be a grandfather, an uncle, a godfather, that when he came into the room, he became the center of attention.
An older brother, yeah.
I mean, yeah. Now it's less so, you know.
I think that's true. I think there was always a sense of hierarchy. And, you know, I think, living with a mindset of 2021 is quite different. I remember being a little girl and having those stereotypes that my dad got home and he was king, right? So my mom served him dinner. You know, if you grew up in a stereotypical Spanish household back in the day, I would get his chancletas. My sister would unpack his backpack. It was like he was king. My uncle, his girls were the same way. And now we're like, you know, my nieces don't do that stuff for my brother-in-law. But up until a certain point, I talked to, you know, I'm 44 and I talked to other individuals who are my contemporaries and older who have similar background. And that was the norm, right? And I think we also sort of have to remember that to a certain extent, you know, the relationship that you have with your father, despite the relationship that your parents have, is quite different, right? So even she wasn't party to why her parents were constantly arguing, because I don't even think we even get into that. Were they arguing really about money? Were they arguing about his alcoholism? What we never really get an idea about what they were arguing about. I don't think we've ever had an opportunity to say they were constantly arguing about this. All we know in the background is that they were constantly arguing, and this was disturbing Sonia, but I can't concretely say, you know, when my parents were arguing, I could remember reasonings, I mean, being that young, but here she never gives us, you know, they were arguing about X.
She said something about spilling milk at one time.
Yeah.
But you know.
Like, isn't that a saying? Like, something about spilled
don't
milk.
cry over spilled milk.
Don't cry over spilled milk. That almost felt like a little bit of a red herring to me, or like she was trying to be tongue in cheek. Because, you know, I hate to say it, because we have this debate a lot in this book club about fathers being present, what are they doing? And, you know, I have to say one thing that about Sonia's, so the author's writing, on the page 95, she says, you know, their life has never been better without him. And even though she missed him, him leaving was the best thing that could have happened.
Leaving? That's a nice way to put it.
So
I think that's, you know, she delineates her life before and after, right? Before it was all argument and it was unpeaceful and all that good stuff. And I think most, you know, some people do that in real life, right? There's the before and after. What was their life before? What was their life after? Of course, I think, I don't want to say of course, because some people could die and people give two shits about it. She misses her father, but she is happy to not be in that environment that she was in before. And the only thing she frankly, I'll be honest, she skirts around the issue about physical abuse. She just talks about the arguing, but I bet money that there was probably some physical abuse there. And she just does not, because when she wrote this book, her mama was still alive. So, and her mother may have not mentioned it to her directly, but I'll bet my last dollar, which I don't have a lot anyway, that there was physical abuse there. It wasn't just, you know, it just wasn't verbal.
And you're probably right, because
Who abused who?
Where there's alcohol abuse, 99.9% of the time, there's physical abuse behind that, verbal abuse, emotional abuse, and you really don't understand what your kids really go through. You know, when you're yelling and screaming at each other, they think that kids don't hear. We hear everything when we're young.
Yep. Yep.
yeah. And, you know, even I wonder how, maybe we'll get it a little later, but in these chapters, I do wonder how that relationship, since she's put so much emphasis behind it up until these pages. Her mother and father's relationship, I do wonder how that affected her relationship when she got to be older and started dating, because she brings Kevin in really quickly. Like, we don't get any background information. She just like inserts him into the narrative, and then he's like kind of gone. And we don't even, I don't know if they're still married, but on that, if you have the physical copy on that front page, there aren't any wedding pictures in here. He's not in here at all.
They're not still married.
Oh, okay.
Was married?
She married and then it didn't last.
She was married to Kevin, the Irish gentleman, and she inserts him so quickly and then takes his ass right back out. And so I wonder, you know, if we're gonna get any real insight on, maybe she's setting us up, you know, in a sense, setting us up to show us what kind of she learned.
There is a wedding picture. If you have the hard copy, there is a wedding picture.
It's just her.
No, it's him and her.
Oh no, I don't have that one in the paperback.
On the hard, wait, I have the hard.
On the hard copy, there's a wedding picture of both of them.
So on the paperback, which is the newer edition, he's cropped out, just to let y'all know. He is not in here.
That's the way we used to do it.
He is cropped all the way
That was
out.
a boyfriend. Cut.
I mean, it's a really beautiful picture of her, but he's completely out of the book. And I'll look at the print line.
Look. This is, can everybody see this picture?
Yes.
Yeah, there it goes. See it?
Yes.
Yeah, that's them.
Yeah.
Wait, he's Irish?
Yes.
He was.
Yes. Didn't you read? Haven't you gotten to that part yet, Brandon?
Yeah, but he doesn't look Irish.
No
in that picture.
spoiler alerts.
No, he is Irish.
I don't think I'm that much ahead. I think
We're not that much ahead yet, because I think in the later chapters we see. But you know what I personally thought? I personally think that her real reason overall for getting married, believe it or not, I think that was considered like part of the culture, especially among Puerto Rican Hispanic women. You know, even not, I mean, ethnic women in general, the idea, even in the United States, of you being an old maid and never getting married is something that was really not acceptable for a long time among women. So I think that she did that really, you know, let's face it, a lot of women will get married because they feel that that is expected of them. Okay, so I really think that her main reason for doing that was really to follow that segment of the culture of what you're supposed to do. And now many women don't feel that they are fully adult, like, until they're actually married. Okay.
It's funny because I don't know.
And this goes back to the conversation. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, I was gonna say, it's funny that you say that, because when we think about when I was Puerto Rican, the mother wasn't married, but she was having, but it was still, what's that phrase in Spanish? The guy was still her marido, right? And I laugh because I sometimes think about, you know, the pressures that existed to a certain extent. Like, oh, when are you going to get married? When are you going to get married? And then when I think about my paternal grandmother, I'm like, this woman wasn't married. She had kids by 3 different men. Like, what are we talking about? So I'm questioning whether her paternal grandmother was married to Gallego, like her father's stepfather. I'm like, that's a good question. I'm like, were they married? I don't know.
All throughout history, that has existed. Women have had children by different men all throughout history. That is a fact.
No, it is, but it's the irony. It's just like, oh, you know, you gotta be a good girl. You know, even the other book, Dominicana, where the
you
sister
gotta be a virgin.
off. Yes, it was like, you have to be a good girl. You just can't go with any man. And then come to find out, like, y'all ain't married either. So why all this pressure? And you don't understand it until you're older. That it's like, oh, well, what, like, do as I say, but not as I do.
But also many people considered themselves married without the paper.
Exactly.
They were in committed relationships, but didn't go through the church and the legal system.
Common law.
Right.
But common law before was common law, because it's one of those things. Is like it's like no es su novio, it's not their boyfriend, es su marido, right? But they have to be married, and I'm like, but it's such a strong word. It just sounds so strong in Spanish, her marido, because sometimes people are going to assume that they're married and they really are not.
And I also think that when it came to Sonia Sotomayor's situation, what I think really affected her marriage was the fact that it seems that she made a decision to not have children. And I wonder if that's when the marriage really broke apart, because the idea of the man never having children is, again, kind of, you see what I'm saying? So I think on her level, I think that she's the one who kind of made that divorce happen, because like, let that man go free and let him go and have children with somebody.
Or maybe he couldn't have kids. You never know.
She made it would be interesting to find out if he ever did have, but we're not going to get to that part. But remember, she made a conscientious decision that because of her decision, of especially her condition as a diabetic and the health situations that she had, she does explain in the book that she made a conscientious decision that she would not bring children into this world.
Oh, she does. What chapter is that?
Oh, I guess we're going further. I'm sorry. I mean, well, okay, we're going to say we're going to say
but she does.
I was like, wait a minute. I read past and I haven't gotten to that point yet.
Okay.
She is married. She's married at 23 and divorced by 29.
Yeah.
And those are her, excuse me, ladies, those are like the prime baby making years.
Yeah. Shut up.
So there must have been a conscious decision, excuse me, I'm not assuming everyone, of course. And she's also in I think law school during that time.
Yeah, but that doesn't stop people from having children now.
That is true.
Okay? You know, I'm just saying that she made a conscientious decision very young to not have children.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that her idea was, perhaps I should be fair and let that. That's I think one reason why her marriage was not going to work.
Yeah,
I think it was her conscientious decision to kind of let this man go.
Good for her.
And she talks about that. She talks about that invisible disease, being a diabetes, and she talks about how she knew that she may not live very long. And she talks about it in two ways. One is kind of a very serious way where she's saying, like, you know, I'm going to get everything I can out of this life because I don't know how much of it I have left. And then she kind of talks about it in a humorous way where she says, like, oh, you know, kids with diabetes shouldn't be waiting in the doctor's office this long. Like, you don't know how much time we got left. Like, our time is valuable. Let's get this moving, you know? So I think that Miss Argelina has a point there where it's like, maybe she understands that her this kind of invisible disease that she has in its totality may not, you know, she may not live very long to see grandchildren. She may not live very long to be able to raise her children the way she wanted to. So I think that her making that decision very early on had a lot to do with the diabetes, which I think is why she mentions it so early in the reading. So we kind of have a footing. She's not saying it like, oh, this is my sympathy card, or like, this is what makes me different. She's saying, like, this is kind of this is really how I built my life, and kind of this was what the foundation that I had to work with. These were the cards that I was dealt, and this is kind of how I played the game.
I think so. From what I read, I think the one thing that resonated to me, and I don't know if it's because I'm familiar with the neighborhood, even though it's changed a lot from what she's talked about. It's a great history book, to tell you the truth. I keep on forgetting, no disrespect to anybody, because I can get in trouble, how old she is to a certain extent, right? Because her mom was born in the 1920s, and just to get that perspective, and her growing up in a time where parochial school, where, I mean, by the time I went to parochial school, the nuns weren't wearing the habit. Some of them were. In my high school, they were wearing the habit. In my elementary school, they weren't wearing the habit. How she talks about going through to school all the way in the same school all the way to 8th grade. So even that is a history marker. There's a part that I'm like, I don't know how true this is. When she was talking about when she was working with her aunt in Southern Boulevard, I believe the part about being escorted by the cops. Of course, I wasn't born at that time, but how she said there were police officers in the top of the buildings with their guns. I don't know how true that is. My parents
That's I lived on 167th and Intervale during that time, and
it
yes,
was true.
that the
It's
whole Fort
true.
Apache thing
It's
was
true,
real.
girl.
It was real.
See Fort
Really?
Apache.
Yep. It was 100% true. I lived in public house,
It was
Lambert
there.
House,
Yeah.
and we
Oh,
had
wow.
cops with guns on the roof. 100%.
Yeah.
It was
They used to
horrible.
walk the beat. They
Really?
used to walk
See,
the
I think
beat.
it's so great for me because it's still my neighborhood.
The cars
And
were
just,
green and black.
yeah, my mom
Yeah.
talks about the blackout of 77, I think. She said I was a couple of months old. So that is what for me starts this era of Boulevard for me. But to read what she's talking about, it's just like, oh, really? I think it's a great history book for those of us or anybody who's not familiar with some parts of the Bronx. And again, they moved again to Co-op City. Like, I was like, God, if you move one more time.
Okay, right. But you know what's interesting is that the link that I put, the docs link, if y'all want to check it out, I found a lot of historical videos of Freedom Land Park. It was like an amusement park that they actually burned down to build Co-op City.
Mhm.
And it was actually really cool. And she talks about wanting to go see the Pope when the Pope came to New York City in 1965, and she talks about Neil Armstrong in 1969 and watching the Man on the Moon. So, and Kitty Genovese, which transformed New York City in a lot of ways. I don't know if y'all know about Kitty Genovese, but there's a beautiful documentary on her. I put a couple links in the doc too about her. And so I think that, although that this memoir isn't built on history like Dominicana is, for example, I still think there are some really great historical markers that the author highlights that really can set us in stone to where we are in history as relation to her life when she's growing up. And I thought, does anyone have anything else they want to kind of chime in on before I introduce another theme?
Oh, so staying on this topic or something else?
Oh yeah, anything else?
I don't know if you all talked about this last week, but I was wondering if we can maybe bring up the conversation of religion and the role that played in her life. And I think for me, one of the things that I noticed is that this might be a bit of an assumption, but it kind of seemed as if religion was something that kind of like the mom at least was doing to kind of check off a box, because it didn't seem as if, like, I know she had both of her children in Catholic school, but it seemed as if her experiences with religion were very like central to the places where religion is held, if that makes sense. So it was like religion was something at school, but it didn't really follow home. And I think the time when that kind of really clicked for me was when she came home and found out that her father died. And this is on page 41. I'm not going to try to read the line in Spanish because I don't want to butcher it, but the English translation was God took him. And at that moment, I was just like, oh, so we're talking about God at home now? That's interesting. And then if you flip a couple pages later to page 47, she was expressing her anger when Father Dolan would not come over and pray because the mother never went to church on Sundays. And obviously she had a lot going on in her life, and she probably couldn't fit that into her schedule. And that's a whole conversation about the church being that strict that they weren't able to extend compassion and empathy in that moment because they weren't following a strict church guideline. But it was just interesting how religion just seemed to be very much like something that Sonia experienced very much individually, and it wasn't connected in all areas of her life. It's not like they came home and talked about religion, or they prayed together, or they went to church together. It was like, we're sending you to Catholic school because that's where you need to be, and that lives there, and that's it.
Yeah, you know, she does even say in chapter 7 that her mom, Celia, did not entertain spiritual things. It's like something she never did. And you know what's funny? I'm glad you actually mentioned this, because even the author mentions that she really wanted to go see the Pope on the class field trip, but she wasn't allowed to go. Why? The only reason she was not allowed to go was because they did not go to church regularly. So she could not go on the field trip to see the Pope. And, you know, furthermore, I want to hear some other thoughts, you know, on this topic, but furthermore, you know, there is that I guess maybe assumption that a lot of, because her grandmother, to my understanding, was very spiritual and was more of like a bruja, but she was like very into spirits and into praying and meditation. And it seems like that didn't rub off on any of them. And that idea of sending I went to like all white private schools, and that idea of Black parents of color, sending your children to these all white spaces in hopes of a better education, I get it, but it's really not the flex that you think it is. And I think she mentions that in one of the pages where she quotes the gentleman from the NAACP, where he also says, like, going to Catholic schools was at one point very gratifying and it did a lot for me, but at another point, I'll find the page where he says it, but she says, like, at another point, it was like a damnation, you know, and that is like 100% true. To be like so engulfed in a world, either in a white world or in a religious world that you are not really a part of, is extraordinarily difficult.
Well, the interesting thing about what you're saying is, in the beginning of the book, we are looking at the Santeria, cultural part of religion that is being practiced by them. And she talks about the way they would sneak off to bed. Her and her brother would be put to bed while they were doing their Santeria stuff, okay? And then the father dies. And after the father died, all that Santeria business went out the window. And it's like the family kind of, wow, this did not work. And that was like a slap in the face for all this praying to the spirits and everything has let us down. Okay, now the idea of going to a Catholic school, especially for a lot of Hispanic, Latino, Puerto Rican families, is something that does stem, I feel, from that colonialism side, okay, of Spain. And believe it or not, our parents didn't, the Catholic school system was supposed to be the better system, because even back home where they came from, it was the elitist, well-to-do families that would send their kids to especially a Catholic school. The girls went to the convent school, and those were the only schools that were available really to educate you. It was part of that colonialism. And remember that all throughout Latin America, 90% of the population is Catholic. Not today, because there's been a lot of infiltration with different organizations and everything. But back during that time, I think that was part of, and the Catholic Church is a very domineering organization on that level. And they did play a big role in the type of colonialism that took place. But if you realize something interesting, and somebody should do a survey or research is one day going to get done, most kids who went to a Catholic school were not religious people. They did not produce a religious population. Okay. And one thing that got to me in the chapter, even if we read in moving on to the chapter, she talks about the way her brother was put at the end of the row or something because he was considered to be not smart. And she talks about some of the terrible things that went on in that Catholic school system. Okay, were you able to read that?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, in page 91, she talked about her pleasure of once she learned how to study in the 5th grade. Okay, at the time, all I knew was that my strategy worked. Soon, Mrs. Riley had moved me to the row next to the window, which was reserved for the top students. My pleasure was diluted, however, when I found out that Junior's teacher had assigned him to the farthest row from the window where the slowest kids sat. Naturally, Junior was upset, and the unfairness irked me too. But he's a boy. He'll get there when he does. The Sisters of Charity held a pessimistic view, yes, of male children. And I remember that I went to a Catholic school. Boys were bad. Those nuns hated boys. I don't know, it was something like there was a big gender gap going on there. And there was something about those nuns were of the belief that girls were good and boys were bad. It was like, I don't know, boys were always placed like at the end of the class, or they were the ones that got smacked the most around with them. Well, actually, the ones that always got hit a lot with the rulers were the boys, if I remember well. So I find that interesting that she's talking about the way those Sisters of Charity held that view of male children. Okay, and that is all part of that Catholic school system. So spirituality had nothing to do. Okay, and religion was not going to infiltrate because her family already feels let down by the spirituality that they did practice, especially because of that death of her father.
I'm going to play devil's advocate. I'm going to actually dispute that to a certain extent. So I agree. I think, I went to Catholic school in the 80s, in the 90s. So I think it's also, by the time I went to parochial school, I think things had started to change slightly, not a lot, but things have started to change. I think part of people sending people to parochial school, it was looked as the better option. For me, anyway, I think there's a lot of reading that you do about parochial school, but I don't know if I have a taste of what the New York City public school system was at that time. I feel like everyone who I know in my immediate family or friends who grew up in the Bronx or what have you, everyone went to Catholic school. Whether you went to St. John, you went to Scallon, you went to Aquinas, so I don't really know. My sister went to public school, but she went to public school because she came to the States when she was 12 years old, right? So where were you going to get English as a second language? In public school, not in parochial school for the most part. So I think that's part of it too. It was kind of seen as the better option, whereas today there's a dime a dozen of these schools that, Catholic schools are closing as a result, and not just because of the tuition, but because of everything that's come out as a result of it. And the part that I think I'm more disputing is whether what her family felt like. It's very clear her mother to a certain extent felt about religion, right? I think her mom could have been spiritual in the sense of, I'm not going to church, but I'm always gonna pray to my God or what have you. But I don't think she had that upbringing of going to church. It's very clear that she was raised by her sister. They were too busy working to really think about going to church. I think she did go to church in Puerto Rico. I can't recall. But I'm not really sure how much of her paternal grandmother's faith in whatever, like Santeria or whatever you want to call it, that she have made passed off to her other children. I don't think it was necessarily cut off to a certain extent. I think it was mitigated as a result of her father's death. But I don't know if it's fair to say that they never went back to that. I just don't think we don't have a good idea what happened with her paternal side of the family, with the exception of her generation. I don't know if her aunt or her uncles kind of just, they just cut that off. I think some of those things, they're too embedded within the culture to be cut off just like that. Disappointment, yes, but I don't know if I'm going to agree that that it just truly went away, because we really don't have an idea. I think we have an idea with her mother. And I also think the Catholic Church, and to this day, is still very rigid with some of those things, right? It's like, going to Catholic Church was an attendance sheet. And how they counted your attendance, they had those damn envelopes, right? So they knew whether you're going to church or not. They didn't know it's true. They didn't need to see your face. If envelope 12 was not there and you didn't give whatever, then they knew you didn't go to church.
Well, I didn't go to parochial school. I went to public school, but there was religion in my family. And I'm only one day older than Sonia Sotomayor. So, and I also lived in that neighborhood. And I also knew of Father Gigante, who she went to because the father of her present parish did not go see her mother while she was grieving. I thought that was cute.
Yeah.
So she said, you know what? I'm not gonna go to this church anymore. I'm gonna go to St. Athanasius, which is my church, was my church. And my mother would send all us 8 children to church just to get rid of us. My mother would not go to church on a regular basis, but my mother did something that my brother brought to my attention. He said, you remember one time when mom crawled on her knees? And I'm like, what are you talking about? So this is a custom that came from Puerto Rico. And I didn't remember this for whatever reason. But the fact that our parents were not religious doesn't mean they weren't spiritual. Doesn't mean that they didn't bring something with them from the church or, you know, from God. There's always a God. And, you know, right now, and there was Santeria every Friday, we would put Santa Bárbara la Bendita, we would clean the house. My mother would clean the house with that music. And I was afraid of that. And we were told to go away. I did the same thing, Sonia Sotomayor, that we peeked. When these ceremonies were being conducted, we were told to leave the room. We would peek and we would see the water in the middle of the room, the glass of water in the middle of the room, and my mother dancing around. And, you know, my brother had coarse hair, so that was a voodoo spell they put on him. So we were all entrenched in that culture, and I'm gonna call it a culture and a religion. And, you know, I love this autobiography. It just brings me back.
Yes, yes, I think that, thank you, Anna.
I don't know if anybody's familiar with Father Gigante's background, but you know, he was also known to have been like a poverty pimp during that time. His family was all mafia.
Yeah.
His family was all mafia, and everything he did was to bring the family money. So, and she spoke of him, but she didn't say those things about him, you know, but that's really what he was.
And his brother who went around in a bathrobe, the chin.
Yeah, he was a nut job. He played it to his death, right?
Yeah. He
got also called on for the abuse that the Padres are, you know, all on court about.
Yep. He sure did. But he was like the beginning of that whole system that was created of preachers and deacons and priests that did the same thing. They exploited the neighborhoods, right, for money. And that's exactly what he did.
And you know, became a politician, right?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely.
And I think Miss Argelina kind of mentioned that earlier. Like, that's what people are talking about when they're talking about like colonialism, and when they're talking about being embedded even here.
Yes.
Like, you know what I'm saying? It's like colonialism on top of colonialism.
Yeah.
And we have about 23 minutes left. And I would love, we can save it until next week, but I would love to talk about race and its role in this book, especially in these last few pages that we read. You know, there is that scene where the author is working at it's like a deli or a bagel shop or something. Zaro's, and she's often mistaken as a Jewish woman. And the customers are like speaking to her in Yiddish, and she's like, oh no, I'm Puerto Rican, or the more derogatory term that Jewish folk use for non-Jewish people. And, you know, even though she does mention about, what's the show, the dad, his name is Archie Bunker.
All in the family.
All in the family.
I love that. That's Trump.
She mentions
Trump studies from him.
she mentions him, and she like, you know, talks about that show a little bit and how it kind of, it's a bit quite racist. To it was like the Family Guy of its time, to my understanding, right?
Yeah, it was bad.
And so I've never seen it, but to my understanding, it's like the Family Guy
it was
of that
worse.
era.
Yeah.
But worse. But so it's
Yeah.
like, you know, she doesn't really dive into any real, you know, racist things that have happened to her. It almost seems as if her, what do y'all think about this? Her life, you know, and I keep forgetting that they were quite poor. There's that scene in there where the guy is coming by her door to collect $2 every month for the drapes, and I'm like, oh my God, they couldn't afford drapes.
That was no, that was a common thing, Brandon. That was a real common thing. My mother even talks about how that was just a thing that they did. So
There were no credit cards or anything, and so that's how they
their kind of
how
form
parents
of
paid for
credit.
things.
It was
Yeah,
like a
layaway.
door credit.
Layaway.
Yeah, layaway. There you go.
Yeah.
Like layaway, but in real life.
Right, but
I
imagine
had
the person selling the curtains made tons of money because everybody in the building owed it.
Yes.
And every week he would go and collect from everybody in the building.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's brilliant. That's almost a story in itself. But
Absolutely. Absolutely. But to go back to what you were saying about her, I noticed that she talks about a lot of racist remarks that she endured as being endearing. You know, like the person saying it, but she knew that they weren't trying to be malicious, almost like they couldn't help being racist or making prejudiced remarks. Like they couldn't help it. They didn't really mean it maliciously. It was, you know, done more in an endearing kind of way. And I was like, wow, you know, and I feel like that happened a lot though. That happens so much, especially, you know, with that, you know, that culture, the Puerto Rican culture.
And I would argue,
endured a lot of that.
And I would argue, Miss Anna Marie, that could only happen to a white passing person.
Oh.
I would argue that what's going on in this book, as far as
passing, she's not passing for white. She's just light skinned.
Right.
Okay, she's not passing for white. Get it?
I
right,
think she
girl.
corrected.
Well, I think she is when she's at the Jewish store.
No,
and speaking to her in
because
Yiddish.
if you're articulate and you have education, you see you're doing that. What they do in school, you trying to be white. You know, you trying to get an education.
No, that's not what I'm saying. Let me be clear.
You're articulate, you trying to be white.
But that's not what I'm saying. Let me be clear. When you are working at a Jewish store and people are speaking to you in Jewish and Yiddish, it is because they think that you are someone who can understand Yiddish.
That's what they
know,
think.
but I think she talks about how she corrected them. And also the owner would let people know she was a shiksa. Right?
Exactly. So it doesn't have anything to do with how POCs are receiving you. White passing, what I'm talking about when I'm talking about white passing is how white people see you. So it's like in this story,
all right,
her view of race, I would agree with Anna Marie, does seem almost very lighthearted when it comes to when it comes to the slurs and when it comes to the Archie Bunker and when it comes to the way
like that too.
The way that she maneuvers in life. Although she is very poor, and she is living in the projects, and there are police officers, or I think she said SWAT team. I think she used the word SWAT team, like on the roof. It doesn't seem like the way she's maneuvering in life is burdened by her race. Does that make sense?
I don't know about race, because it's not a race. Being Puerto Rican is not a race.
Yeah, you also have to keep in mind that her world is very small. It is within that community. So she really doesn't have to deal with a lot of people outside of her race. Her whole community for a large part of her life, unless she maybe is at, once she gets to Cardinal Spellman, maybe. But it's all Puerto Rican or Black or Afro-Caribbean. So the racism thing, even though we were aware existed, if you stayed within your own little orbit, you really on a day-to-day didn't get it, especially at a young age, you didn't perceive it until you sort of grew up and sort of realized what was going on.
Yeah, I absolutely concur. If your world is that small, I mean, I grew up with Puerto Ricans, Ecuadorians, up until really I went to college. That was my world. So I think for her, I think she's also, I don't know who mentioned it. It might have been yourself who mentioned it. I think she's being mindful of what she says about race to a certain extent because of her cases, right? Because there, she talks about, I forgot what particular topic that she talked about, like inner city and what's available in the inner city in the libraries, and how that influences her decision and her mindset as a judge. So I think that she's mindful about how much she says about that in this book, because it does clearly influence.
She's still a judge.
She's still a judge.
Yeah, she's still a judge.
He's a high judge.
This book is she's very diplomatic.
Yeah.
I don't care what anybody says, it's really diplomatically written.
Yeah, you're right.
But I still agree about the small world. I absolutely agree about this world. If your family lives upstairs around the corner, then.
No, you're right. Because if I'm not mistaken, when they moved to Co-op City, it seemed like everybody just kind of followed them, and they like her aunt lived up the street, her other aunt lived on the daybed in the house, and then like the uncles moved around the corner. So she never really lost that sense of community because it kind of just followed them. So yeah, you're right. You're right.
What's that, insulation?
But still, her world was not, even with that, that's still quite an advantage, that when you don't have to face the world like that, when you have that luxury of being able to have that small knit community, and you don't have to face,
the interesting thing here is, I agree what you're saying. She is an avid reader. She read a lot, and she talks about like when her mother got the encyclopedias, Britannica, and those are the kind of things that her mother preferred to get for them.
Yeah.
But she talks about being in her own world and going to the library, and something, even me as a child, what happens to it really is like, I had the new book of knowledge, okay? She would be in her own world, and she did like to read a lot. She read a lot, because in one of the chapters here, she talked about the other things she tried, and she talks about, I wasn't gonna be good at ballet because she was too clumsy, and they even took guitar and everything, but none of that worked for her. So she read more and more and more. She was an avid reader. She loved to read. Now, when we move into chapter 8, she gives a good expression. She talks about the diabetes that she has and how she has to be going to her appointments in the doctor's office. And on page 100, she's talking about the Nancy Drew books, and she talks about that imagination and what that does to her. Yeah, books were her escape. So she had her culture, because you're right, Hispanic, Puerto Rican, that's considered a culture, not a race. Okay.
Yeah.
It is. It's a culture, because guess what? The Hispanic culture in general comes in all shades and colors, and I don't know, it's not until people come to the United States that all of a sudden race becomes an issue. But you know very well that over there, you can come, I know there's an upper and maybe a lower class, but there are people of all races, and you have blonde hair, blue people, you have Asian looking people there, and they're all considered this is a cultural experience. So she is very fond of her culture, obviously, but at the same time, she does manage to go into her own world. And she talks about, like when she talks about Nancy Drew, okay, the world they live in. Now this page 101, I'm just gonna read, is a kind of fairy tale where people own houses on winding, tree-shaded driveways, visit summer homes at the lake, and attend charity balls at the country club. Okay, Nancy travels too. She's even been to Paris, she says, which I found that interesting. Okay, because she is very detailed. Okay, and what I wouldn't have given, she said, to see the Eiffel Tower one day. But even though Nancy Drew is rich, she isn't a snob. And even though it is fiction, I knew such a world did exist. It wasn't Cinderella and pumpkins turning into carriages. It was real, and I was hungry to learn about it. And I found that interesting about how she was determined to come out of her cocoon. She was determined to come out of her world and venture. And
well, not only that, but she uses Lord of the Flies. When does she use Lord of the Flies to like determine how that world would work in the Bronx? You know what I'm saying? So I think like these ideas of race, of culture, of class are all, you can't separate them, right? I think they're all, I think they are 100% together in this book. I think that it's almost impossible to take them apart from each other. And I think that it is, it's unfortunate that it is not, hopefully it'll come later in the book, but I do think that there's a lot of room here for, or maybe not, because when she, for example, when she talks about being in the aunt's store and she's like the security guard and she's like 14 or 15 and her job is to like watch for people shoplifting, and she says like it was always the junkies, and you can tell how, because in the summertime they would have like long sleeves on, or like, and they would always have like dark circles under their eyes, and I wouldn't even have to like do anything. I would just say, like, she kind of paints this scene, but it kind of brilliantly, she doesn't mention skin color or hair texture or Spanish speaking or English speaking at all. You know, I don't, either it's brilliant or it's a dodge. I can't tell yet which one it is.
You had to live it, girl. You had to be there to understand it. Yeah, I understand that.
Well, I wasn't there. That's why.
Well, you know what? She wasn't poor. I think you keep alluding to the fact that she was poor. I don't think she was poor. I think she was working class, which is a big divide. Poor, I was, you know, being on welfare and things like that, because a lot of people, you know,
I think, there's a difference.
She was, and then when she goes to Puerto Rico, she comes in contact with professionals. I think she's mentioned something, I forget what chapter. She says she comes in contact with professionals in the family. So, you know, but then again, she was raised in the South Bronx, and that was a community.
I think you're referring to the professionals that she came across when she went to visit Puerto Rico with her grandmother. Remember, that's where she said, that's the only time I ever saw Puerto Ricans, you know, with professionals.
They weren't in her family.
In New York, I never saw them. She said, aside from my mom, the only, you know, I didn't know any other professionals.
I guess, and you know, just to put it into a little more perspective, from where I see things in life, the seat that I'm sitting on in life, I guess for me, if you live in the projects, that's poor.
No. Not in those days.
There's a lot of,
not in those days.
No.
Not in those days.
The projects
and then
were
going to Catholic school, you needed money.
That's
you needed to pay for parochial
Yeah.
school, so no way.
Especially
now you don't want to live in the projects, but back then you wanted to live in the projects.
Back then, it was
back then. Projects were for people trying to move up. It was for the civil servants. It was for the policemen and the working class people, so that they could have a place to live.
She talks about not having like food at one point, and she talks about how the doctor left them like part of a life insurance policy or something like that.
No, what you're saying is the doctor had advised her father to get a life insurance policy. But when the doctor passed away, he left them $5,000.
Yeah.
That was nice.
And that's how they moved to Co-op City.
Yeah.
That's how she was, because you have to buy the apartments in Co-op City.
Yeah.
You know, or share, not the apartment.
Is the share.
Right.
Yeah, I think her mother in Puerto Rico might have been considered poor, like in that sense of struggling. But here, I think they were most likely lower middle class, if anything else. There's a lot of middle class individuals to this day.
They were working class,
working class. But even today, like, you know, I hate that whole status thing and income disparity. But it is what it is. But yeah, Like they weren't dirt poor.
But I don't think working class is that far removed from being poor.
I think that's the point I'm making.
Okay.
Like, I think working class are poor people with jobs.
I think that's the point I'm making.
Especially now.
You can easily be poor and work every day, in this country.
But I
No,
think
there's
back
this
then,
beautiful, there's
Ron,
this beautiful saying that
You're
Oh.
100% right, Ron, because think about it. A lot of people live check to check.
Yep.
They literally get their
Yeah.
check, the check is spent before it even touches their hand. But they have
Mhm.
a job and they go to work every day. And you would
Yeah.
never think, you would think they got it going on, and they really don't.
we're
Yeah,
talking
they're
about
just
the
like a
60s
paycheck
and the
away from
70s.
being
It's a little
poor.
different.
yeah. There's
What
this
were you
beautiful
saying, Brandon?
But working class, just based on the definition, I think it varies over time. I think my perception of working class, it talks about manual labor, right? But that doesn't mean that equates to poor, right? To me, it could sound like they're working class, but if you're doing all kinds of overtime, you can make six figures easily, depending on what type of work you're doing. So I don't know. I think that's a topic for another time to kind of figure out what that means.
That's
or
another
not.
book, Ron. Brandon was gonna quote somebody. What were you gonna say?
You know what? There's this beautiful quote that says, there's two men. One is an alcoholic, and he gets drunk every single day, and he lives in a project building, and his neighbor goes to work every single day for the city, and they both live in the same tower, and they both live the same life. That's what I'm talking about when I'm talking about working class being poor. You shouldn't have to work every single day for right when you get your check, it goes to your rent. That was the idea, to my understanding, of Co-op City, where it was this idea of affordable shares, affordable housing that was also safe, because come like the 70s and the 80s, the projects were really dangerous in New York City. And the Co-op City was like an escape from all of that, from people who had real jobs, firefighters, policemen, nurses, but they couldn't afford to live anywhere else in the city. Co-op City was an escape for all of that, right? I'm not sure, does anyone not live in Co-op City right now? Anybody on this chat?
Myra does.
I have friends that live there.
What's the vibe of it today?
It's too damn far. That's how I feel about Co-op City.
It's
Even
sinking.
back then.
Co-op City is sinking.
But you know what, Brandon, what you're saying makes a lot of sense, because I grew up in public housing. My mom worked, and the biggest complaint my mother had was, I'm paying all this money to live in the projects, and I still have to climb into a pissy elevator. It's not working half the time, and I don't get nothing more than somebody who's paying zero amount of money because they're on public assistance. And she complained over and over and over growing up about that, until she moved and bought a co-op in the Bronx and left us the apartment, me and my siblings. But that was her biggest issue. We're living in the projects, I'm paying all this money, and I don't get anything extra that somebody else living next door to me gets.
That's when the projects went down. The projects were not always like that.
Yeah,
Right.
because, I remember I grew up in the projects too. And I remember, but the projects I lived in, it was very strict. I remember if a situation with a neighbor, her son was teasing a paper airplane out the window, they sent her a letter threatening eviction. You couldn't even walk on the grass.
You can walk on the grass.
And those were back in the day where if you didn't pick up after your dog, not only would you get a summons, they would take that animal away from you.
Good.
That's how it was actually in the projects.
It was serious in the
Very
project.
strict,
It
okay?
all went downhill.
Yeah, well, there's a reason for it to have gone down, and that
And
could
I
be
also,
all by
That's
itself.
another book.
That's a whole book all by itself. Sure it is.
I also think that most of the people who moved to Co-op City probably were leaving tenements as opposed to leaving projects. Because the tenements were really, they were being abandoned by their owners. That was fire.
Ron, for those of us who don't know, can you just briefly kind of distinguish a tenement from a project building?
Yeah. I don't know the science behind it, but a tenement is usually 6 stories or less. They tend to be walk-ups. They tend to be pre-war buildings. And we have every other block, there are 100 tenements in the Bronx. So you see them all the time. You may not be able to define them, but they usually are 6 floors max, no elevator, pre-war buildings.
Fire escapes.
Fire escapes, bricks, 100% brick, old windows, yeah.
Art Deco.
And the project
Yeah, they could
buildings
be
are
Art
like the
Deco.
towers, right?
Like the whole Grand Concourse, you would probably consider tenement buildings.
A big ass
but
bedrooms though.
Some of those are really fancy, fancy tenements, but.
Yes.
And
yeah.
tenements were also described as mostly like slum, rundown, you know, like when you describe the difference, I think.
Yeah, I don't know if I would agree with, I think that's how they were labeled after the white flight.
Right.
And they were, but when white folks lived in them, they were, you know, other than them being so close together.
That's not entirely true, because I know when the Irish lived during the Depression, it was like slums.
Yes,
Total
you're correct.
slums, and they were considered tenements, yeah.
Yeah, and not all tenements are, I mean, I live in a pre-war building, and like this entire block, for the most part, is most of the buildings around St. Athanasius School are pre-war buildings. Like, if you know the area, you know that's a fact. These buildings have been here forever and a day, except probably the Sister Thomas building that's relatively new. And they're also a lot bigger, more spacious. And I think that's just because back in the day, everybody and their mother lived in a 2-bedroom apartment, right? So my bedroom is probably above, like the square footage is above average of what you would find in a lot of the new building they're constructing. So, and you're right, the one in the concourse, no one wants to give those up.
Oh, you didn't get affected by the fires, Myra?
And
you didn't get affected by the fires?
No.
You still live over there in that neighborhood?
No, because with the lot that was empty for years, which is across the street from Huts Point Library, that's the Sister Thomas building. But everything else on this block, for the most part, is a pre-war building, except for the building in the corner, because I still remember as a kid when they built that building. But other than that, like from my building onwards, even the one across the street from the Pentecostal church, some of those are pre-war buildings.
But it's not even so much that it's pre-war. Tenements are usually just like rented to tenants, where in buildings, it's apartments that are rented to tenants. So in a tenement, you would find just rooms rented.